Hello everyone, and welcome to the finale of the Jane Eyre Adaptation Comparison Series. I can't believe it, we're here! Today we're going to park ourselves at the end of the story, taking a look at the last 3 chapters of the novel by Charlotte Brontë and how 9 different adaptations handled them. And this is going to take a while, so I hope you're comfortable. In chapter 36, Jane says goodbye to her cousins Mary and Diana, saying she expects to be gone for at least 4 days, and they don't bother her with questions. 36 hours and a full year later, she's back in familiar territory. Part of Jane tells her to go no further than the inn and get the information she seeks there, but she's eager to see Thornfield again and presses forward with nervous excitement, not even sure how she'll react to what she sees. What that turns out to be is the last thing she expects, a blackened ruin. Roof, battlements, and chimneys have caved in, the lawn is wrecked, and based on the interior, the fire happened some time ago. She goes back to the inn for answers and gets them from the chatty innkeeper, who happens to have been the butler at Thornfield in the olden days. He tells her about the fire, and about a lot of other things besides, the scandal that came out about the mad wife locked up in the house, and the attempted bigamy with the governess who ran away. Understandably, Jane doesn't want to hear about any of that. It's believed that a few months after Jane left, Bertha snuck out of her chamber and set fire to the room beside hers and to Jane's old room. Rochester got all the servants out of the house and then went back to coax Bertha down from the roof. But Bertha eluded him and instead jumped to her death. As he descended the stairs, they collapsed and he was buried underneath. He survived, but one eye was lost, the other was blinded, and his hand was so crushed it had to be amputated. He now lives in seclusion at Ferndean Manor. Jane makes arrangements to be taken there immediately, and in chapter 37 she arrives at Ferndean, a remote property so hidden away in the woods that Jane wonders if she's lost. At dusk, she gets to the house just in time to see Rochester step outside. She watches him from a distance, saddened by his, quote, desperate and brooding countenance as he takes hesitant steps and gropes at empty air, brusquely rejecting his servant's offer of help. When he's returned inside, Jane goes to the back door, stunning the 2 servants with her reappearance. She tells John to fetch her belongings and announces she'll be staying the night. Rochester rings for a glass of water and some candles, and since he's unlikely to receive a visitor, Jane takes the tray in to him herself. The moment she enters, Pilot recognizes her, and Rochester, confused by unfamiliar sounds and the disturbance in routine, wonders what's going on. Upon hearing her speak, he wonders if he's gone crazy. He reaches out and grasps her hand, recognizing her fingers, her face, her shape, and pulls her close. But he fears she's just a dream, and though she assures him that she's real and won't leave him, he's afraid she'll disappear like the dreams he's had before. Only her statement that her uncle has died and left her £5,000 is real enough to convince him, because how could he make that up? What follows then is several pages of conversation. Rochester is full of doubts, especially when he hears Jane's now an independent woman, but he can't bear to be away from her either. Instead of responding to him with pity and empty words of encouragement, Jane teases him, criticizing him in that light-hearted way of hers, which is just the right thing to soothe him and brighten his mood. They dine together at her insistence, and Jane relishes the easy, natural companionship between them, something she missed at Moor House, and it's an indication of just how right they are for each other. There was no harassing restraint, no repressing of glee and vivacity with him, for with him I was at perfect ease, because I knew I suited him. All I said or did seemed either to console or revive him. Delightful consciousness. It brought to life and light my whole nature. In his presence I thoroughly lived, and he lived in mine. Blind as he was, smiles played over his face, joy dawned on his forehead, his lineaments softened and warmed. Jane promises to stay and be his nurse, his housekeeper, his companion, making the assumption that she'll be his wife. Then it strikes her, what if he doesn't want to marry her still? Meanwhile, he's troubled because she doesn't say she'll be his wife. The idea of Jane being around all the time, so close and yet not close enough, is distasteful to him. That situation would only lead to frustration. But he considers himself less of a man than he used to be, and he doesn't want to foist himself on her in all his helplessness. Jane goes off to bed, keeping him in suspense about who she's been with, and if there were only ladies there. She figures that fretting about that will keep his mind off his own problems. The next day, they go for a walk, and Jane tells him what's happened to her in the last year. Rochester makes some comments about her hasty departure and what would have happened if she had stayed. Whether or not you believe him, well, that's up to you. I should not have left him thus, he said, without any means of making my way. I should have told him my intention. I should have confided in him. He would never have forced me to be his mistress. Violent as he had seemed in his despair, he in truth loved me far too well and too tenderly to constitute himself my tyrant. He would have given me half his fortune without demanding so much as a kiss in return, rather than I should have flung myself friendless on the whole wide world. I added a word in there, it's just in the wide world. Whatever, I'm not going to read it again. I love the ping-pong match that is Rochester's cross-examination about St. John Rivers. He asks about St. John's qualities and appearance, frustrated by all the good she has to say about him, knowing that, on paper at least, St. John's the better match. He keeps fishing for some flaw, some criticism, and Jane can see what he's driving at, but doesn't give him a break. She aims to make him jealous as a means of provoking him out of his misery. It's not unlike how Rochester used Blanche Ingram to invoke Jane's jealousy, which is not a style of courtship that I care for, but I do appreciate how the tables have turned and how Rochester, at least for a moment, is having to suffer the emotions that Jane felt. It's kind of like getting a taste of your own medicine. The more disgruntled he becomes, the more playful Jane is, and finally you have the banter fully unleashed. And there's this cute little thing where she's sitting on his knee for this entire conversation, and once he's decided that she should marry St. John instead, he keeps telling her to get off, and she's like, "Nope, I like it here, you'll have to push me off." But even when she declares that her love remains and she will stay with him forever, he's inclined to be melancholy. What right in the state that he's in does he have to claim her and hold her back from achieving greater things? It's at this point that he clarifies that he doesn't want a nurse or a companion, he wants a wife. And in a proposal so different from the first one, so much more tentative and tender, he asks her again to marry him. And instead of expressing disbelief and shock, Jane responds with confidence that she will. Rochester still is incredulous, and he says, "You're just making a sacrifice." And she says, "Sacrifice? What do I sacrifice? Famine for food, expectation for content, to be privileged to put my arms round what I value, to press my lips to what I love, to repose on what I trust. Is that to make a sacrifice? If so, then certainly I delight in sacrifice." Jane wants to be loved. She always has, from the very beginning of the book. But she also wants to be needed, and she wants someone she can pour her love out on, who will receive it and reciprocate it. Rochester fits that bill. And that settles it. Rochester's like, "Let's get married at once." And Jane's like, "Look how late it is, time to go in." It's here that Rochester gives his final monologue, acknowledging God's divine intervention in their lives. He knows he's been humbled for the better, and he expresses gratitude for God's beneficence and mercy. And it's revealed that a few nights before, he'd begged God for release and cried out to Jane. At the very same time, she heard his voice, and he heard her answer. The final chapter, 38, begins with the famous line, "Reader, I married him." It's a quiet wedding. They don't even tell their servants until after it's happened. She writes to her cousins to let them know. Diana and Mary are happy for her, and Diana wants to come visit as soon as the honeymoon's over. St. John does not reply for 6 months, and when he does write back, he does not acknowledge her marriage, but they maintain a correspondence. Jane speaks of visiting Adele at school and finding her unhappy. She pulls her out and finds a better situation for her. Then Jane reveals that she's been married for 10 years, and she and Rochester couldn't be happier. Their marriage is ideal. 2 years into their marriage, Rochester begins to regain the sight in one eye. The improvement is enough that he's able to see his firstborn son. To satisfy any reader's curiosity, Jane lets us know that Mary and Diana are both married and visit with the Rochesters every year, and the novel ends with a few words about St. John, still unmarried, toiling away on the mission field in India, approaching his imminent death with joy. That's the summary. This reunion is probably a favorite scene for many Jane Eyre fans, and why wouldn't it be? It's a bittersweet romantic reunion, a long-awaited and well-deserved happy ending. Charlotte Brontë pulled off a remarkable role reversal here. Their financial positions are switched, Jane's gained the confidence that Rochester has lost, the dependent has become the independent, and vice versa. This puts them on a more equal footing, which allows their relationship to come into full bloom. I'm not sure that they could have been as happy together if all of these other things hadn't happened. I referred to their marriage a moment ago as ideal. That's really how I see it. I don't know how many marriages there are in real life where two people are so perfectly in sync with each other. There's true equality here, and I don't mean that in the sense of equal entitlements or equal benefits. It's an equality of giving and receiving. She belongs completely to him, and he belongs completely to her. You look at the endgame here and think, I'd like that. Not all of it. We can do without the whole surprise, I have a crazy wife locked up in the attic thing, but I'd like to find someone who fits me as well as they fit each other. For anyone asking the question, why did Brontë end with St. John, I don't know. Unless it's documented somewhere, I don't think any of us can say what exactly Brontë was thinking or intending with that. It is like Jane to end her own autobiography with a focus on someone other than herself, and readers would certainly be curious to hear what became of St. John. Jane, or Charlotte Brontë, wants to make it clear that St. John was doing a noble thing, but those who expressed concerns about what it would do to his health were also right. This ending does underline the religious or spiritual conclusion, but I do think that could have been achieved just as well if it had ended with Rochester holding his son and thanking God for tempering judgment with mercy. This is an important scene, obviously, and all the adaptations include it. What they end up doing with it, however, varies quite a bit. Time spent on it ranges from 3 minutes to 23 minutes. Some versions wrap it up in just one scene, others take a few scenes, like in the book. I do favor the versions of this scene that include humorous banter. I have talked many times about how much I enjoy that aspect of Jane and Rochester's relationship, and it's important to me that it be part of the end of their story. The more banter, the better. It's also important to me, and it was actually a friend who pointed this out years ago, that Rochester regain his sight. His blindness can be viewed as a punishment, a symbol of the consequence of wrongdoing. Rochester made some poor decisions and harmful mistakes, but by the end of the novel, he's supposed to be forgiven. Forgiven by Jane, forgiven by God, and forgiven by the reader. Regaining his sight is a symbol of that forgiveness and regeneration, and is the final piece of Rochester's redemptive character arc. And now, finally, it's time to talk about the adaptations. I do feel this is probably the best scene in the 1934 version of Jane Eyre, though it's nowhere near being the best version of this scene. Since Jane had already been told about the fire and Rochester's condition, that's why she left the mission in the first place, she's not shocked at what she finds when she arrives, apparently in the middle of a snowstorm. Mrs. Fairfax lets her in the room with a loaded tray, and Rochester, unaware who he's speaking to, starts complaining, mostly about the slow service. Jane speaks up, close to tears to see him like this, blind, but with two perfectly good hands, and he responds to her voice very slowly. His joy is short-lived. Reminded of his own condition, he turns distant and painfully polite, and when she insists she's come to stay, he turns her down, rejecting what he perceives to be pity. His half-hearted accusation that when he was worse than blind she had no mercy seems to imply he still holds her leaving against her. Meh. It's in this scene that the casting of Colin Clive makes the most sense to me. His characterization of Rochester is surprisingly light in some places, but here he's morose and tortured, something Clive excelled at. Rochester tells Jane to leave, and she moves behind him. Mrs. Fairfax comes back, and he asks in defeat if Jane's gone. In response to his sad tone, Jane returns to his side, promising that nothing's changed and she'll stay with him forever. The film then ends with a reappearance of impish Adele, an addition that seems, for this quirky adaptation, strangely appropriate. It's okay. This is a great scene in the 1944 version. The story of what happened is stirringly told by Mrs. Fairfax, played by Edith Barrett, who, just a little trivia for you, was Vincent Price's first wife, as the camera pans over the burned-out wreckage, accompanied by Bernard Herrmann's score. It's a haunting moment. The monologue style might not suit the impatient viewer, but I like Mrs. Fairfax's dramatic retelling as Jane stands amidst the rubble. Only about half of the adaptations have Jane get a close-up look at Thornfield. The big change is that Rochester's still living there. Before Mrs. Fairfax can reach the conclusion, Pilot announces Rochester's presence with a happy bark of recognition for Jane. Jane's smile disappears as she sees Rochester. He's blind, but again has two hands still. At least they added in the unkempt appearance, which makes Rochester look a bit like a pirate. Not bad. Modern audiences might say he looks normal, but it was not stylish for men to wear beards like that in either the 1840s or the 1940s, so the fuzzy beard and untamed hair conveys that, wow, he really let himself go, as does the open shirt and the lack of a coat. He chastises Mrs. Fairfax. Adele is waiting for supper in another wing, and then he senses that someone else is in the room. He knows her voice in an instant, and then uses his hands to make sure it's really her in the flesh. Forcefully, Rochester rejects her pity, believing it's the only thing she can feel for him now, and protesting that for her to stay with him would be a waste. Jane begs him not to send her away, and Rochester responds,
"You think I want to let you go?"
Then, without having to reaffirm their feelings, they embrace. The film ends with an epilogue, Jane informing the viewer as she and Rochester walk the familiar grounds that he gradually regained his sight and was able to see how much his newborn son resembled him. I don't really have any complaint with how this was done. It's neatly compressed into one scene. Jane and Rochester don't talk much, but the emotions, the yearning is there. And even though there are some things missing, obviously, it's very aesthetic and gets the most important points across, and I really couldn't ask for more from this adaptation. Likewise, the 1970 version leaves some things out, but conveys what it feels are the most important elements. Jane approaches Thornfield in an open carriage. Her expectant smile turns into a look of dismay when she rounds the bend and sees the house. On closer inspection, wow, the place really is ruined. Piles of charred timber scattered everywhere so you can't even get from one side to the other. The old butler John happens to be there and approaches to inform her of what happened with Bertha. On hearing that Rochester's still alive at Ferndean with Mrs. Fairfax, Jane moves to go to him, but John checks her with a warning about Rochester's blindness, so she'll be prepared when she sees him. We then cut to Rochester walking down a lane with Pilot, Ferndean behind him. We've seen Ferndean before in this version. Rochester showed it to her during their engagement. Jane watches silently a few yards away as Rochester eases himself onto a bench. Yep, he's still got both his hands too. She makes a little noise when she steps forward, and he hears it, but when no one answers him, he second-guesses himself, having no faith in his remaining senses, and kind of blaming Pilot for the misunderstanding. Jane draws closer to Rochester's continued bewilderment. Finally she speaks, and at first he's hopeful, then dismissive of what he thinks is a trick. This time, it's Jane who reaches out and touches him to prove she's really there. Scott keeps his eyes closed rather than staring vacantly into the middle distance like most other Rochesters. The only visible change is a scar over one eye, and perhaps his hair is a little more grizzled and fluffed at the temples than it was. The greater change is in temperament. Rochester is significantly mellowed. Jane's reappearance doesn't throw him into a mood. On the contrary, though he's not sure why she's there, he acts pleased that she's come to visit, and doesn't show any trace of jealousy when he thinks she's married or engaged to another man. Scott's playing Rochester with a lot of restraint here. It's like the whole thing is a dream for him, too sweet to be reality. Maybe Scott's maturity in the role works in his favor. He projects a man who's accepted his fate rather than one wallowing in misery.
Cry. No need for tears.
He encourages her to get married, reminding her that she's not someone who can be choosy, and she playfully tells him that he can't either. Jane's confidence here is a treat, so different from how she was before. This exchange is similar in spirit to the book's conversation about St. John, just not as specific. Rochester, who of course isn't able to read Jane's expression anymore, winds up confused about whether or not she is getting married. If so, he'll bring Adele home for the wedding. She clears that up, and Rochester, as if to assuage her disappointment, assures her that some fool will find her, so he is envious. And she responds,
I hope so, sir. Some fool that found me once before.
She then tells him that she's come home, let her stay, and gently leans against him. He reaches up and covers her hand with his own before the camera pulls away, leaving them alone together in peaceful solitude and contentment. I like what I see here, and I would have liked to see more. That's my main disappointment with the scene. I don't mind the unusual interpretation of the ending. It's a nice, gentle note to end on. It's that it doesn't extend beyond this initial reunion, so the story feels like it wraps up prematurely. Thanks once more to the 1973 version for getting us a little more on track. We join Jane as she walks the last stretch home to Thornfield, sporting a new but modest wardrobe and still puzzling over the voice. This is the only shot we get of Thornfield, no establishing shot of the house from the road like in most of the other versions. Jane steps into the ruins briefly and takes one long look around, then rushes back to the inn for answers. In talking with the innkeeper, Jane has to keep rephrasing her questions, stopping herself from using language that might give her away. As in the book, the innkeeper's all too eager to tell her about the governess, and, he's gotta be suspicious of her identity since she keeps asking about Rochester's welfare. Who else would be that concerned? Once she knows Rochester's location, she leaves without another word, which I also think would raise an eyebrow. The next shot shows Rochester emerging from the darkness of Ferndean Manor. Finally, someone cut his hand off. Ugh, that sounds terrible. Other than the amputation, there's not much that's different about him. His hair is kinda boofy, but the scar makeup is minimal. Not much for Jane to observe from that distance, but she can see how he walks and how he jerks his arm away from the servant who tries to help him. Jane then enters the kitchen, surprising the servants, and the man looks downright giddy to see her, like, "Yes, we're all saved!" The second Jane comes in with a tray, she has to shush Rochester's ginormous dog. That's not enough to clue Rochester in that it's her, or maybe he refuses to trust his own ears. When she says more, he fears he's going insane. He's desperate to touch his visitor to put an end to the mystery. On closer scrutiny, we can see one eyelid has been folded slightly with a little spirit gum or something. 2 eyes, 1 hand, can't win them all. With his facial animation somewhat restricted, Jaston seems to turn instead to vocal dynamics.
No, I cannot be so blessed. It's a dream.
He only truly believes it's her when she kisses him, and even then he's astonished when she doesn't disappear. It's that strong undercurrent of emotion in his voice that makes this a moving scene.
It is you. You're not dead in some ditch, under some stream, nor a pining outcast amongst strangers.
He's as changeable as he ever was, though, and throughout this whole scene and the next two, the adaptation follows the conversational flow in the book very closely. Rochester does refer to his missing hand and shifts the limb in his vest, making it obvious that Jaston's hand is just tucked against his side. Either that, or he's got an absurdly long forearm. After dinner, he's more himself, having gotten a little used to the shock of Jane being back. This is the first version to have this line.
Were there any ladies in the house where you've been?
Good night.
The next day, they take a walk together, and Jane's having way too much fun vexing Rochester with her evasive answers about St. John Rivers. Rochester just gets more and more worked up, but Jane's relentless. These actors inhabit the characters in their own way to the last, with Jane's warm declaration that he's not the ruin he thinks he is, and his broken, almost childlike clarification of what it is he really desires.
Friends will ever lean towards you.
But I want a wife, Jane.
Do you, sir?
There's no more lack of certainty between them. They kiss, and all's well. The very end is a bit anticlimactic, I think, with Rochester and Jane riding away in a carriage, while Jane explains how Rochester's vision returned in one eye. It would have been nice to cap it off with something a little more, I don't know, ta-da! I have no idea if you'll understand what I mean by that. The 1983 version devotes its entire final episode to this section of the book. It actually starts by taking us back a little bit, but still within the confines of chapter 36, so it's fine, to Jane saying goodbye to her cousins. This is a testament to how much time the adaptation had to work with, as all the others have a speedy transition from Moor House to Thornfield. Mary and Diana express their surprise and their concern over Jane's health and safety, but they see her off with love and hope that she'll come back soon. Jane is dropped off at the inn and asks about the distance to Thornfield. She's undecided about whether or not she wants a room there, but not about her purpose. The innkeeper offers to take her since he's going out that way, but she can't wait and takes off on foot, running the 2 miles as fast as she can, only to find Thornfield a shambles. Jane enters and looks around the place, burned but not unrecognizable. The camera focuses on the staircase, its banister broken. She's startled when the innkeeper appears. He came to make sure she was all right and to bring her back if she so desired. I like how they managed this part. Partway through the innkeeper's explanation of what happened, it switches to a flashback of the night Bertha burned the house down. We see her steal the key to let herself out and set one of the bedrooms on fire. Then we jump to Rochester helping a servant down the stairs. When Bertha's spotted on the roof, Rochester ignores the protests of his staff and goes back in, but as he extends his hand to his wife, she screams out that she hates him and hurls herself to her death. We then return to Jane, who's horrified by the tale but full of compassion at Rochester's misfortune. She commands the innkeeper to take her to Ferndean at once. And there's Rochester, walking out of the house with a nervous servant standing by to help him. Jane watches soberly from afar, but we get a close-up of Rochester, that 180-degree turn giving us a quick look at the eye, and a good view of that hair. Note in this one that Rochester doesn't angrily shake off his servant, but accepts his aid with stony resignation. Jane knocks at the kitchen door and they let her in, stunned speechless by both her unexpected return and her new confidence. Her sunny presence is welcome to the melancholy servants, though they sadly warn her of what she'll find with Rochester. But while Mary's afraid of what her master will do if his orders aren't followed, Jane is fearless. In the room, Rochester has got his hand outstretched waiting for the water, which she gives him without a word. He doesn't really have any idea that anything's different until Pilot barks.
Down, Pilot.
Then, with a heavy sigh, he seems to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But as the silence continues, it just doesn't feel right. Jane refuses to identify herself, and Rochester is about to go out of his mind.
What delusion has come over me? What sweet madness has seized me?
No delusion, no madness.
We get our first good look at his face here, the long jagged scar over the eye with the lid stuck down, and it looks like he has a special contact in the other eye, which, if that's the case, is a nice touch. Notice it's only when he touches her fingers and recognizes the feel of her that he dares to speak her name. He clasps her in his arms and kisses her, but too soon the mood breaks. He thinks he's dreaming again. Jane, however, does her best to convince him. When she tells him of her new wealth, he starts to turn cynical, thinking of all the friends she must have now, and when she promises to be his nurse and his companion, he becomes angry, dissatisfied with that prospect. He shouts at her to leave him, and she does. Jane and Mary are in the kitchen talking when a repentant Rochester comes looking for her. He asks her not to go. Now that he's felt her again, he couldn't bear it. It's not that simple, though. And so Jane's teasing begins as a means of distracting him and repairing their relationship. She makes him dig out a comb for his hair and makes him eat supper even though he says he doesn't want it. By the way, I like the job they did with his hand. It's heavily bandaged enough to look realistic, but not overly obtrusive. Jane bustles around domestically and then settles beside him. We have some lovely exchanges where Jane makes him laugh, and then she leaves him with that cliffhanger.
Were there only ladies where you've been?
Good night, sir.
They go for their walk, Jane leading him through the trees to a little bench. We get the St. John dialogue in full, including Jane's cheeky responses. When she describes St. John as handsome, Rochester looks like he's gonna be sick, and I love that Rochester even kind of makes fun of his name.
St. John Rivers.
Finally, we have an adaptation where Rochester talks about calling out to Jane. Jane doesn't make a big fuss about it, but you know she's pondering it. Then he tells her, "I don't want a nurse, I want a wife." It's an abrupt transition in a summary like this, but not as delivered, and I like the softness of Jane's acceptance.
Will you marry me?
Yes, sir.
And even then, he's like, "Are you sure?" There's a final epilogue over a shot of Jane reading to Rochester. She tells how he regained sight in one eye just before their son was born. Where 1973 ended with the words "tempered judgment with mercy," 1983 ends with "bone of each other's bone, flesh of each other's flesh." That's an interesting little contrast. Both phrases come from Brontë, but aren't what she chose to end the book with. They both work, they just have a slightly different emphasis. This version of the scene pretty much checks all my boxes. The only thing I wish we got to see more of is Rochester's lightening up under Jane's influence. There are enough hints of his humor to assure you that it will come back, but since that's something I enjoy so much, I would have liked to see even more of it. But maybe they wanted to keep it somber and not rush things. In the 1996 version, Jane sees the ruins of Thornfield Hall from the coach. It stops and she gets out for a better look. The property's so run down that the sheep have taken over. I find this bit of editing a little confusing. We see Mrs. Fairfax looking out a window, then Pilot comes running to greet Jane. She hears Rochester's voice and goes in before Mrs. Fairfax is able to catch her. What's confusing is that I'm not sure if this place, which seems to resemble a cottage, is an intact wing of Thornfield, a property adjacent to Thornfield, or Ferndean Manor. We don't see Jane travel, she just appears in a different location. Anyway, Jane hasn't been forewarned about the blindness, so she's disturbed when she enters the room and he still calls her Mrs. Fairfax. Unless I missed something, which is always possible, we never see Jane finding out about the fire. This adaptation, similar to the 34 version, has Rochester called back from going after Jane because the house is on fire. Actually, it's the sight of Bertha frantically running around and screaming on the roof that makes his decision. Jane rides away completely unaware as we watch Rochester rush back to Bertha, pushing past servants who are trying to save as much as possible. Grace Poole has gotten Bertha down from the roof, but she won't go down the stairs, and in the struggle, Bertha pushes Grace and she falls to her death. Bertha is startled by this and a little mesmerized. Rochester then urges her to come down, telling her not to be afraid.
Please give me your hand. Bertha, come to me. I would never harm you.
Taking another look at Grace's body, Bertha decides to throw out her arms and jump to her own death. Rochester then turns to go down the stairs, but they collapse and he disappears in the flames with a cry, leaving his fate unknown until Jane sees him again. Back to the present, very interesting interior design in this room, with a low, curved ceiling. What is that, a buttressed ceiling? The green door gate thing to the left looks like something out of a stable, though, so I'm not sure what this dusty room was built for. It's Rochester's lair now, of course. I do wonder who he's been playing chess with, and how, but I suppose chess is one of those games a skilled enthusiast can enjoy even without seeing the board. Jane's slowness in getting the water and her telltale little noises, like her footsteps and rustle of her skirts, tell him it's not Mrs. Fairfax after all. When she speaks, he gives a quick inward gasp. As he does, we get a decent look at his face. The makeup here is pretty good. No scar to speak of, but they sufficiently covered up the eye so that it's plausible that it really is gone. It doesn't twitch if Hurt blinks either. He's got both hands, though. It's a quiet scene. I do wish Jane was a little more responsive. No wonder he thinks it's a dream. She's not saying anything or moving. He asks the dream to kiss him before she goes, and she does, with the promise that she'll never leave. And that's when the music kicks back in, playing in the background as they talk a little more, she again promising that he'll never be alone as long as she lives. That prompts him to stand up, turning to her with a pathetic expression and giving the "I'm no better than, in this case, a ruined tree, etc. speech, but she contradicts him, telling him how full of life he still is. They embrace, and it's a nice little moment. Again, there's an epilogue to wrap up the loose ends. Rochester's sight is regained, and he gets to see his baby, and Jane mentions that Adele's brought home to live with them, and they treat her like their own daughter. Jane and Rochester and Pilot walk together, and the charming picture fades into a monochrome print. The movies tend to give you a more streamlined version of the ending like this, which gives you a pretty different picture compared to one of the miniseries, but it's fine. Now, when I was doing my video prep, watching these scenes separately for the first time, there were only two that made me tear up. The 1997 scene, believe it or not, was one of them. We see Jane making the long journey back to Thornfield, riding beside the driver. She stops the coach partway, insisting she'd rather walk the rest of the way. She actually runs, and when she reaches the first point when she can see the house, she stops short, wondering in a panic if she's too late. For an explanation, she goes to the priest who almost married her in Rochester, an economical choice since he knows she doesn't need the background info and would rather he cut to the chase. His telling of events is brief but to the point. Jane makes her way to what I assume is Ferndean and lets herself in, glimpsing Rochester in a seat by the window. Jane removes her cloak and bonnet as she approaches, and Pilot makes his way over. Rochester calls to Mrs. Fairfax for his water, and she comes hurrying in, almost bumping into Jane. Amazingly, she keeps the tray steady. Gemma Jones's Mrs. Fairfax is always one of the most sympathetic. Here she looks like she's about to burst into tears with surprise, joy, and lingering grief. Jane takes the glass over to Rochester with a smile, but her expression changes when Rochester turns and reveals the other side of his face. Perhaps she didn't know the full extent of the damage. She recovers, though, and puts the glass in his outstretched hand, then says,
"'Tis my pleasure."
Jane, is that you?
He dismisses this as madness or a dream until she speaks again, and then he touches her and believes, and for a moment he's happy, until she tells him she'll be his nurse and companion, and then he jerks away. There are some added lines here. Rochester asks who told her about him, and she insists it was no one. She came back because she couldn't fight her feelings for him any longer. In this shot, we can see both of his eyes. He seems to be wearing a contact lens in one, and his hand, which hasn't been amputated but is wounded, probably beyond repair. Jane tries to argue that he's not ruined, but he doesn't want to hear it. He gets up and starts saying things like, "So, you didn't find a husband then?" trying as usual to bluster his way out of an uncomfortable situation. She tells him cheerfully about St. John Rivers, and Rochester's sarcastic takeaway is that she was lucky to escape being tied down to him. Jane serenely counters that she can think of nothing better, but he won't have that. In this last climactic section of the scene, the script nearly abandons Bronte's text to go with its own dialogue, a risky move and one I'm not normally a fan of, but I cannot argue with how well it works in this instance, as Rochester tries to get her to leave, and Jane refuses to do so with a look of determination. I can't play the whole clip for you, and I'm not going to repeat all the dialogue, that wouldn't be the same anyway, but if you're not familiar with this scene, maybe you should check it out. I found it to be far more emotional than some of the others. At her persistence and her words of love and devotion, Rochester's tears begin to flow, and no matter your opinion of Hines' Rochester and his angry outbursts, it's hard not to feel for him here. He is a broken man, she is the strong one now. At her embrace and her calm reassurance that she'll never leave again, he completely breaks down in her arms, where she holds him and comforts him. Once again, we have an epilogue showing Jane and Rochester with two of their children. There's a funny bit where Jane seems to feel a bug on her neck and scoots forward, and Rochester laughs. I like that. Barring the nitpicky complaint that she says he regained his sight after 3 years, not 2, a pointless change, but not something worth getting upset about, this is a very pleasant ending. As a whole, I've always thought this version is okay. Watching it piecemeal like this, which is not how any adaptation of anything is meant to be digested, I've learned that individual scenes leave a lot to be desired. But the adaptation has a few strong moments, and in my opinion, this is one of them. I said there were 2 versions of the scene that made me tear up. The other one was 2006. Jane's headed back to Thornfield and gets out of the carriage early to walk the rest of the way. The house is already in view, but she doesn't notice its burned-out condition until she's much closer. A series of shots show the dilapidated frame as the eerie sound of crows overhead becomes almost overwhelming. Jane sits on the ground in defeat, to look, to think, to grieve, to consider her next move. A farmer comes along and starts talking. It turns out he used to work for the Rochesters as a stable hand, and he fills her in on what happened. As he begins, we go back to that night. Bertha enters Jane's empty bedroom with a lantern and finds the wedding dress still hanging where Jane left it. The next thing we see is Bertha taking a leisurely stroll down the corridor, dragging the burning dress behind her. The focus stays with her as she goes up to the roof, getting what might be her first good look at the night sky in years. As she dances in the smoke and moonlight, Rochester appears, extending his hand and begging her to come down. Instead, Bertha defiantly steps up on the ledge. Her operatic theme crescendos, and in a strangely beautiful moment, an owl catches her eye as it takes off from the battlement. In her face we read fascination and a desire to imitate its flight. Bertha raises her arms and jumps, and for a brief moment she does fly. Then it's back to Jane, now walking through a misty wood to Ferndean Manor. Good job on making it feel secluded. As she pauses outside the house, Rochester steps out, and at first she can't tell anything's wrong. She steps forward in delight, snapping a branch underfoot, and he looks straight at her and asks who's there. She watches in silence as he feels his way back inside. The next scene shows Rochester impatiently asking for his water. He's sarcastic and miserable, but I still can't help chuckling at what he says and how he says it. Jane appears, rattling the tray in her anticipation, and Pilot gets excited.
What's that? Has Pilot gone mad like the rest of us?
I like how Jane is eager, but also a little unsure of what to say, how to announce herself. Rochester can sense something's different, and when she gently holds the glass up to his mouth with a cloth underneath to catch any drips, he knows this isn't the usual manservant. At her first words, he grabs for her, but even as he feels her fingers and hears her speak, he's unsure. It's the moment when his eyes fill with tears, I think, that makes me want to cry too. Stevens nails it here, the expressions, the emotional delivery. This reunion has a satisfying combination of joy, sorrow, confusion, remorse, and Jane is wonderfully sensitive, knowing when to be kind and gentle, when to tease, when to change the subject. We join them again after supper, where Jane sits on his knee and digs around for a comb. Not sure why, because his hair doesn't look that messy. I get the idea that Rochester would let her do whatever she wanted right now. He's putty in her hands. She bewilders him with a few words about the people she's been with, just enough information to keep him awake that night. The next day, Jane and Rochester sit by a stream. She describes their surroundings for him, something she's better equipped to do thanks to all that time he spent showing her the flora and fauna, but at the moment he's more interested in hearing about St. John Rivers. Jane pulls his leg a little, but then the tone of the conversation shifts. Rochester tells her how he cried out to God and called for her a few nights before, and she pauses in her sketching, putting two and two together, but she says nothing and lets Rochester go back to the topic of St. John. This is the kind of banter I look for. Again, I can't help laughing at Rochester's frustration over her glowing report of St. John's greatness.
He asked me to marry him.
You're lying. You made this up to torment me.
Oh, he asked me more than once.
Well, then I think you might take yourself off and go elsewhere.
Finally, Jane clears things up for him, trying to ease his mind, but when she stands to go back inside because it's late, Rochester's troubled and wants to stay. She mentions the Italian villa he talked about the night of the wedding when he tried to convince her they could pretend to be brother and sister, and after a pregnant pause, he concedes that that's not something he's interested in anymore. He gets a wee bit more descriptive about what he wants than other versions do. That's the 2006 way. And then she tells him,
Your life is not yours to give up. It is mine. All mine, and I forbid it.
Finally, with that settled, they kiss and fall backwards on the grass. The final epilogue shows everyone gathering for a great big family portrait. That includes Mary and Diana and their husbands, Adele, Hannah, Mrs. Fairfax, George the elderly servant, Grace Poole, Pilot, and Jane and Rochester holding the two little Rochesters. It seems Rochester has not regained his sight, at least not yet, but interestingly, when the frame overlay is added, there's St. John's portrait up in the left-hand corner, sort of a nod to the book's last line. 2006 has two big advantages to me here. One is the emphasis on the good humor and the chemistry they share, which is right there at the ready, even after a year of separation. The other advantage is how moving the performances are. I am not one who cries over love stories. There are a couple exceptions, but Jane Eyre is not usually one of them. Sad death scenes and parent-child stuff is typically what gets me, not romance. So kudos to 1997 and 2006. You got me. Lastly, we have 2011. Jane rides to Thornfield, jumping out and running down the long driveway in her haste. She slows to get the first full view of the house, and then she realizes. There often seem to be birds flying overhead in these scenes. It puts me in mind of scavengers hovering over the dead, though there are no corpses at Thornfield. We track Jane through the wreckage, getting a very good view of several rooms completely destroyed. I think this might be the most extensive version when it comes to damaged Thornfield. Her distress increases the more she sees, and at last she comes to a stop when she finds Adele's abandoned doll. She bends to pick it up, and Mrs. Fairfax appears in the doorway behind her. We're not told why she happens to be at Thornfield. It doesn't seem like anyone could live there. She struggles to believe that it's really Jane Eyre she sees before her, not a ghost. Then, like in the 1944 version, she informs Jane what happened as Jane continues to look around the ruins. Mrs. Fairfax doesn't say that the stairs collapsed as Rochester was descending them, but that he stayed on the roof after his wife jumped, as if wanting the fire to consume him, like he had a death wish. Mrs. Fairfax takes the opportunity to explain that she had no idea the woman locked up was his wife, and she tells Jane tearfully that she needn't have run away, that she would have given her some money and helped her so that she wouldn't have to suffer on her own. They hug, and then Jane asks where Rochester is now. With a new direction, Jane completes the last leg of her journey. It's a quiet moment as she slowly approaches, her face full of emotion when she takes in the sorry sight of a forlorn Rochester sitting under a tree with his dog. She walks up and lays her hand on his without a word. His clothes are disheveled and he's got quite a beard. He still has two hands, but he is blind. Their dialogue is minimal and softly spoken, his voice hoarse, like a combination of emotion and probable lack of use. Jane gently teases him with the line, "Fairfax Rochester with nothing to say," and her quip about being a human being, but she doesn't go too far with it, sensing perhaps that he's too fragile to bear much teasing. She kisses him, and he presses his head to hers, still believing he dreams. The last line is her awakened then, as she leans into him, and with a heavy sigh of relief, Rochester finally believes. Most of the adaptations, films, and miniseries have that 10 years later epilogue, that's what I've been calling it, to wrap things up and let us know that Jane and Rochester are happy and well and he's regained his sight. For whatever reason, they decided not to do that here, and I do miss it. It's a short reunion and conclusion with little to no dialogue from the book, but it is sweet and it is effective. The end. And a very good ending it is, too. Jane's finally happy, Rochester's finally happy, we're happy. I think 2006 is in the lead for my personal favorite version of this scene right now, but, you know, they're all good. Each in its own special way is a good ending. I'd love to know which ending you like the best, so please feel free to share your own thoughts on this part of the book and the adaptations of it in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. And that's it. I'm done. I can't believe we went through the whole book. And now I can finally put all these DVDs back. I've had them stacked here on this bookcase since I started this series in April of 2018. I had no idea it had been going on for so long. I want to thank each and every one of you for watching and for commenting and for sharing these videos. I am so grateful for your contributions to these various discussions, and I've enjoyed seeing where we agree and where we differ in our preferences. Comparing scenes from Jane Eyre adaptations by watching them side by side is something I kind of always wanted to do just for my own amusement, but it was much more fun to do it with you than to do it by myself. I wouldn't say I'm coming away with any earth-shattering discoveries or revelations. The versions I liked going into this are still the ones I prefer, but I do have a newfound appreciation for certain ones I hadn't loved so much before. And scrutinizing each of these 9 adaptations shot by shot has emphasized for me that each adaptation has something unique and valuable that it brings to the table. I've found a lot of little details to delight in whenever I watch these adaptations again, and I hope that those of you who have come along on this journey with me have as well. I hope you've enjoyed this video and this Jane Eyre adaptation comparison series. Thanks for watching.